of all, thank you, Lucian, for inviting me. Thank you, everybody, for coming here today to explore a couple poems, and in my case, a poem that's considered to be possibly one of the more difficult modernist poems. Harold Bloom, the great literary critic, the great late literary critic, who I don't always agree with about everything, but he said, and this should be comforting to people, actually, that in the end, finally, it's possible, maybe it's not possible to completely understand everything in the idea of order at Key West. And that should make you feel good, because if you read it and you don't understand everything that's in it, then neither did Harold Bloom, and he was considered to be a really smart guy. So this is a poem that I did not understand for a while, and suddenly one day I read it, and I understood. I went from not understanding it to understanding it in a flash, and in fact, could not from that point on remember why I did not understand it. It just made itself known to me. So I'm going to give you my version of my view of it. And we're going to look at some micro aspects of it and also the macro. I'm going to read it first. I like to read this poem aloud because of just what Joel was saying, because of the sound, the idea of order at Key West. She sang beyond the genius of the sea. The water never formed to mind or voice like a body, holy body, fluttering its empty sleeves, and yet its mimic motion made constant cry, caused constantly a cry that was not ours, although we understood, inhuman, of the veritable ocean. The sea was not a mask, no more was she. The song and water were not medleyed sound, even if what she sang was what she heard, because what she sang, she uttered word by word. It may be that in all her phrases stirred the grinding water and the gasping wind, but it was she and not the sea we heard, for she was the maker of the song she sang. The ever-hooded, tragic gestured sea was merely a place by which she walked to sing. Whose spirit is this? We said, because we knew it was the spirit we sought, and knew that we should ask this often as she sang. If it was only the dark voice of the sea that rose, or even colored by many waves, if it was only the outer voice of sky and cloud, of the sunken coral, water-walled, however clear, it would have been deep air, the heaving speech of air, a summer sound, repeated in a summer without end, and sound alone. But it was more than that, more even than her voice and ours, among the meaningless plungings of water in the wind, theatrical distances, bronze shadows heaped on high horizons, mountainous atmospheres of sky and sea. It was her voice that made the sky acutest at its vanishing. She measured to the hour its solitude. She was the single artificer of the world in which she sang. And when she sang, the sea, whatever self it had, became the self that was her song, for she was the maker. Then we, as we beheld her striding there alone, knew that there never was a world for her except the one she sang and singing made. Ramon Fernandez, tell me if you know why, when the singing ended and we turned toward the town, tell why the glassy lights, the lights in the fishing boats at anchor there, as night descended tilting in the air, mastered the night, portioned out the sea, fixing emblazoned zones and fiery poles, arranging, deepening, enchanting night. Oh, blessed rage for order, pale Ramon, the maker's rage to order words of the sea, words of the fragrant portals dimly starred, and of ourselves, and of our origins, in ghostlier demarcations, keener sounds. So before we get to the macro, what does this all mean? What could it possibly mean? I like to do some close-up looks at the poem and look at any formal elements the poet is working with, because sometimes people jump to the emotional part or the philosophical part and they don't notice that it's all in rhyme or has some formal elements. So this poem, I went through and started counting the syllables, as I sometimes do when I pick up the sense the poet is working with some sort of limiting structure, but I can't quite see it. It's not an obvious one like A, B, C, D, so on. So he's shooting for 10 syllables a line and mostly making it. Sometimes he goes to 11, especially in the first stanza. That's okay. You can shoot for 10 syllables and you can go to 11. It's legal. And then after he gets his second stanza, it's just, he's smack on 10 syllables. So usually when that happens, you're hearing iambic, mostly iambic. It maybe loosens it up a little bit here and there. So there's a name for that when it doesn't rhyme, but it is in a meter. And anybody know what that is called? What is that? Could that be called? Maybe somebody can put it in chat.
Is it blank verse?
Yeah, it's blank verse. Blank verse, no rhyme, although he has a lot of sound, assonance, consonants, slant rhymes, sometimes smack on rhymes that sort of wind through it in all kinds of ways, and a constant sort of doubling back, repeating a word, repeating a phrase, and then kind of bursting forward and doubling back. So you're getting all this sort of an array, a panoply of sound, but not smack on rhyme. So blank verse, right. And then I'd like to, after we've just figured out, okay, so he's working with that limiting element. He's not just sort of talking off the top of his head a bunch of ideas that just came to him. Every syllable is considered, every word is considered. And when I go through this, and it was helpful for me to memorize it when I did memorize it, because I began to notice there is not a word in here. I cannot find a word in here that I would replace with another word. I can't even find a word in here that is equally good to the word that he used. Before I get to my next little part, in fact, I wanted to mention something else about the blank verse structure that he's using. As I read it, I don't know what other people's experience of it is or how it lands on them when you read it, but when I read it, I get that is incredibly chiseled, careful, and stunningly, luminously precise. But at the same time, he gets that sweet spot, That is so hard to get in poetry, where it also has a naturalness of the language. You know, sometimes with bad rhyme and bad other kinds of poetry, the syntax gets twisted around, or the poet will twist the syntax in this unnatural way in order to make the end rhyme. And words don't come out of people's mouths that way. Here, throughout, it almost could be somebody talking, if it was a very brilliant person talking, who happened to talk in poetry. But the syntax is that natural. If it was only the dark voice of the sea that rose, or even if colored by many waves, if it was only the outer voice of sky and cloud, of the sunken coral water wall, however clear, it would have been deep air. But no, it wasn't deep air. It was like, you could, as an actor, I could almost present this as a monologue on the stage and make it sound spoken. It's that natural, and yet it is that exacting and crisp. That's what I mean about that sweet spot. Now, in terms of choice of words, just for the fun of it, sometimes with my students, to get them to appreciate a poem more than they are appreciating it at the moment, I will give them a great line of poetry, and it has to be a very great line of poetry. And can't do it with just any old poem. And I say, I want you to put in a word here where I have left it blank. And you're gonna, and the poet has, their choice of word. And I want you to, what would you put in here? So I did this recently with my UCL Extension writing class. And I left out, and I did this. I went, as we, then I put verb, as we verb, her striding there alone. And the other one that I did was, let's see, what was my other one? Well, I'm going to go to that one first because I can't find, I had another good one too. Oh yeah, I gave it away. Oh, I ruined it. I ruined part of it. Okay, what I gave them was, as we verbed her, verbing there alone. That's what I gave my group. And now I want you to put in a noun and another noun, as we something. But I gave it away, the second one, to you all. So now you all know. So they went into this, and they generally came up with something that was like, as we saw her walking there alone, as we glimpsed her, skipping there alone, jogging there alone, as we spotted her wandering there alone, stuff. They came up with stuff. And then I gave them what Stevens had actually chosen. So great. I discovered it myself when I memorized it, and I had forgotten this word, and I substituted another word, just to get through it, and then went back and looked at what Stevens had actually put, and went, oh my God, like the Valley Girls in the 80s who wandered in the malls. Oh my God, it's like so good. Oh God, that feeling. It's not saw, it's not glimpsed, it's not spotted, it's not noticed. As we beheld her. Well, you can't top that. As we beheld her. And with that word, he gets the quality of a visitation from a metaphysical world. It's almost biblical, right? What do you behold? You don't behold your dog chasing a squirrel. You behold an angelic presence. So he gets that sense of otherworldly power, a rare envisioning, a rare sighting of something that a presence that's almost otherworldly, but then with this great verb, which is not walking or trotting or jogging or exploring, it's striding. Oh, it is so great. Well, you can't beat striding. I challenge anybody to try to come up with, because this then, it almost contrast, it does contrast the ethereal quality of beholding, because striding is so personal, purposeful, vigorous, directed, focused, energetic. It's such a worldly presence that is striding. She's not sort of like this 19th century maiden. Sometimes I think many of the critiques I read, I think, get this woman all wrong. I'm always arguing with some of the literary criticism I read on this, about this, going, no, you don't understand her. She's not this frail, diaphanous muse who's sort of floating along. She is striding on that beach, and her song, she's organizing it all inside her song, and it's that directed quality. So that's just an example of 2 words. We went to 2 words, and you can do that with other words in here too. Now, in terms of the meaning of the poem that suddenly came over me, that was so obvious to me, I don't know what was wrong with me before. Was I stupid? Was I an idiot? Was I blind? Was I deaf? What, Lisa was over there cracking. Joanna's cracking up. If any of you have ever had that moment before, it just became clear to me that the singer is the imaginative shaper who pulls in all the stimuli of the world coming in from every direction through all the 5 senses. And if there's a 6th sense, through that sense also, pulling them in from everywhere and organizing them. Because after all, this is called, it is not called, and poetry sometimes gets described in a certain way that's rather narrow, that can be narrow. It's part of what poetry does, but it's not everything that poetry does. It's one aspect. If I ask middle schoolers what's poetry, they say it's feeling. It's feeling. And I say, and then we have a conversation about that. Well, doesn't music also express feeling? Doesn't theater also express feeling? Doesn't art express everything? Express it? Don't we express feeling when we just talk? I mean that. So and it's not called the idea of emotions and the feelings at Key West. It's called the idea of order at Key West. So the singer is ordering everything that comes in through her senses and through her intellect. And it is coming out in the form of song, of music. Now, this could be said of any artist, right? Could be, but I'm going to make a case right here and now that Stevens, he might allow that, yes, visual artists might do this, and playwrights and other literary people and dancers might do this. But first and foremost, he is interested in poetry, and the singer is the poet. And keep in mind the ancient link between poetry and song to begin with. They were almost the same thing if you go back far enough. And that tradition is honored in all kinds of ways. Sonnet means little song in Italian. That's all it means. The songs that the villanelles came out of the music of the French, I think it was it the 11th century? I think it was 11th century troubadours that wandered through the towns of France, the villages, singing to people who often couldn't read. And out of that came the villanelle. And then, but there's a deeper reason that I'm convinced that the singer is the poet, and what Stevens is most interested in is what is poetry? What is it the poet does? Well, does anybody know? And I don't blame you one bit if you don't know, because I did not know this myself until fairly recently. Does anybody here know what the the poet laureate of Scotland is actually called? They don't say poet laureate. Poet laureate, the English have their poet laureates. The US now has its poet laureates. But does anybody know what the Scottish poet laureate is called? Interesting to think about. Okay, I'm not surprised you're stumped, because I would have been stumped if you'd asked me a while back. The Scots mocker. And I'm pronouncing that as well as I can in Gaelic. Gaelic or Scots, actually, well, Gaelic, I get Gaelic, it's Scots. They call it Scot. And look at how it's spelled. Whoops, here's how it's spelled. Right? And it means, which in Scots means maker. The ancient bardic tribes that wandered the shores of what would eventually be England and so on, called what the bard was called the mocker, the maker. And where did they get the word maker? Well, it seems to have come somehow or another from the Greek, from the ancient Greek. The ancient Greek word for poetry, very much like our current word, poet, P-O-I-E-T-E-S. P-O-I-E-T-E-S is the Greek word for poetry, poetries. But what it means, it comes from the Greek word poem, which means to make. And the poet is, in the Greek translation from Greek to English, means the maker. And how do I know? You're all asking, you're all saying, yeah, but how do we know that Wallace Stevens knew all this stuff? Well, I'm going to tell you. Who wants to know how we know that Wallace Stevens knew all this stuff? Lisa wants to know. Mary Rose wants to know. Okay, Joanne wants to know. Because he studied Greek and Latin. That's how he knew. So when he says, it always gets a chill goes up and down my spine, or a hot flash goes up and down my spine. I don't know what it is, but several temperatures go up and down my spine every time I read. It was her voice that made the sky acutest at its vanishing. She measured to the hour its solitude. She was the single artificer of the world in which she sang. And when she sang, the sea, whatever self it had, became the self that was her song. For she was the maker. And I go, there it is. There is my... Finally, this late in life, I get my justification for being a poet, which sometimes I have questioned the path I've taken in my life. And I go, who cares about what's going on out there in the literary world and whether I get published in this important journal or that important journals? These important journals that sometimes don't publish my work, they're going to be gone. They're going to be gone, but what endures is the maker. So yes, so that I think that's most of what I have to say, or at least it will be enough to maybe start a conversation. I think I went over my time. Oh, well, hope we got to listen to how much over my time did I go here today? I don't know. I got to rolling. I want everybody to feel good about being engaged with poetry. This for me is the ultimate of anything I've ever been able to find, the ultimate justification for the art of poetry. And it is not sentimental. And it is also not self-congratulatory, which I hate. I always cringe when poets just start rhapsodizing about how important it is what they're doing. It's always sentimental and it's always embarrassing. I mean, Stevens is able to not be sentimental, not be self-congratulatory, because although he's sort of in the he's in the poem himself. We didn't even get to the Ramon Fernandez part. That's okay. We didn't, well, that'll be the next chapter some other time. We didn't even get to the final movement of the poem where the poet himself appears commenting, but somehow he's not praising himself. By directing it out and just praising the singer, the maker, the sort of the eternal poet. He's not just saying, I'm so important. He's kind of both the poet and an onlooker at the same time. Yeah. Okay, Lucian, what do you want to do?
Well, I'd love to open it up to questions from everyone. I guess I'll kick off with a question of my own. Try to keep it short and straightforward. Stevens famously remarked that the poem must resist the intelligence almost successfully. And I would only add one word to that. You mentioned allowing your students to add words or replace words. I would say the successful poem resists the intelligence almost successfully. So I guess the question to now that I framed it, like, don't you think to some extent he resisted the intelligence too successfully? It took you 40, 50 years to finally figure out the poem.
Oh, I wasn't reading the poem for that long. I came to the poem kind of late. Stevens was never an early influence at all. In fact, Stevens was very non-Fresnoian. I mean, if anybody knows the Fresno, even aesthetic is too fancy a word for Fresno. I mean, after all, we're talking about Fresno. I mean, one of the most blighted places in some ways, although in other ways, a very interesting place. I came to him late. I was not, and there's no other poem of his I like as well as this. There are other parts of poems and pieces of poems, and some of their poems I do like. You know, I like 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird, and I like the Snowman, and I like the ones that other people
of mere being. You've got to love that one.
Of mere being.
Yes,
okay.
The Poem at the End of the Mind, Beyond the Last Thought. That's one of the best poems.
Okay, I will love that one. I promise to love that one too. Yes, but when I started to read this poem, I would get into a certain part way through, and I would want it to be a different poem. I would want it to be a more specifically imagistic poem, because that's what I tend to favor, that type of poetry. And I don't think I gave it a full chance until I gave it a full chance. But it was, like I say, not 50 years. And then when I came to understand it, though, I became very covetous of it and possessive of it. And I don't want other people to misunderstand it. Because I went to Juster and I read a few. And people were talking about, arguing about is the singer the muse and things like that. And I'm going, no, she's not the muse. She's the maker. He comes right out. The muse inspires others to create the song, write the poem. She is the singer. She is the maker. And then I would argue with the feminist critics about something they didn't like, that she disappears out of the poem. And I'm going, oh my God. I mean, she dominates the poem. What do you want? Just because Ramon Fernandez steps in for a moment and anyway, and I love Ramon Fernandez, by the way. I adore Ramon Fernandez in this poem. Lisa, did you want to
Yeah,
say something?
you said you came to understand who Ramon Fernandez is, and you said you came to see where Stevens is in the poem. Can you
Oh, I
tell
love
me
Ramon Fernandez.
who the heck is Ramon Fernandez, and where is Stevens in the poem? I need to know the answer.
I love it. I love it. Every time when I first started to read the poem seriously, I would get to a point and forget. I would forget that there was this sudden other move in the poem. It's going along. The poem's a certain thing. It's surrounding a certain subject, a certain intellectual problem. What is the imagination? What is a poem? What does a poem do? How does the poem order objective reality, which is what he's really talking about? And then all of a sudden, this voice out of the freaking void says, Ramon Fernandez, tell me if you know why, when the singing ended and we turned toward the lights of the village suspended there. And it just gave me this great chill. And I loved that suddenly there were these two guys. Ramon Fernandez is such a beautiful name. And you try to put in another name there. I challenge anybody to try to put in another name that is sonically beautiful. Tell me, Ed Johnson, if you know why when the singing ended. Tell me, Skipper McCoy, why when the singing ended. I mean, you can't, nothing is going to be that good. Now, there was no Ramon Fernandez. He's a straw man. The voice of the poet needed another voice to talk to turn casually to somebody, and as they're watching the singer, and they decided there never was a world for her except the one she sang and singing made. They figured that all out. The poem needs to make another move. And I think it's a brilliant device. Remember, Wallace Stevens was the lead attorney for Hartford Indemnity and what's the other? Not indemnity.
Indemnity and Security Company, I think it was.
Insurity and something like surety, indemnity, and this insurance company, right? And he eventually became the director of it. He loved the job. He really loved the job. He loved it almost as much as being a poet, and maybe equally, because he didn't want to give either of them up. And so he was among these very rather down-to-earth people, shall we say, or not imaginative people. They were people who were trying to figure out how not to pay people the insurance that they owed them after their house burned down. They were, and some people were interviewed. They were all after he died. Everybody went and descended on Hartford Indemnity and Surety or whatever it is, and interviewed these people who'd worked with him, the great poet. And they said, you didn't know any Ramon Fernandez. Ramon Fernandez would have been Cuban in Key West. But what he did know, by the way, what he really, really did know was Key West. And he would vacation out there. And Key West fills this poem with its sounds and images and impressions and the vitality, the strangeness, the sense of mystery, the vastness of the wildness of the ocean, the light, the quality of the light, that place where he says theatrical distances, bronze shadows heaped on high horizons, mountainous atmospheres of sky and sea. He's not making that stuff up. But he had to make Ramon Fernandez up, as opposed to, Ed Smith, who he knew. Yeah, so that's what that's doing there. He needs that figure in the poem to just turn casually and ask the question. Ask it as a question within the poem. Yeah. Okay. Anything else? Jill?
Yeah, I'm thinking about the play between order, since that's in the title, and order in what we humans can establish as systems, and kind of the role of and what can't be pinned down, what can't be fixed. And I think that so much of poetry, maybe poetry plays with both, is constantly moving between the two, between craft and word order and this and that, and the mystery, and what really shouldn't never be entirely digested or fixed in one strict meaning. So just sort of to Lucian's point about, if you read it 40 times and you can't pin it, maybe that's actually a successful poem.
Yeah.
But it seems to me also I still really want to think about maybe the singer or the poet as this kind of mythic, this goddess, in a way, or something beyond, is it like, because just because the beyond, the only way we can think about anything beyond is in our most physical terms. So her striding would be would be part of that paradox that would still it's still of us and something beyond us.
Well, let me ask you this.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll put it as a question. Are you comfortable with the singer existing in both worlds, the physical and the metaphysical?
I think so.
I
Yeah.
am. Well,
Yeah.
then we see her the same way. I'm comfortable with her being of this world and not of this world.
Yeah.
I've read some literary criticism and analyses, very, very smart people who have a PhD. I don't even have a PhD myself. And they're struggling to sort her out and place her in a tradition of Greek muses and then decide what that means and decide how they should feel about that and so on. And I just go, I'm completely comfortable with, I don't believe, I will say this, that Wallace Stevens actually stood on an overhanging something or rather and looked down on a woman striding along. Well, he might have heard a woman singing. He might have heard a snatch of song. We don't know where the impetus, we never know where the impetus of a poem comes from unless the poet tells us. He might have heard a snatch of a song at the ocean. I don't think he saw this sort of powerful woman striding across the landscape, singing, and thought, oh, hi, what a good idea for a poem. So she's a creation, but she is a creation that is, I think it's a mistake to see her as a wispy muse-like figure or a mere apparition or an angel. She seems to have a physical vitality and an extraordinary there's a word, it's not a talent, there's a force. There's always a force and a purpose to this character and a focus, a vitality, which in his day, he wrote this pretty early on, 1934, would be considered almost not even almost, it would be considered a masculine vitality. There's nothing dainty and frail and ladylike about her. And so I I don't struggle with her at all, but I also agree with what Jill says, that that the poem is full of mystery. It embraces it, the mystery, it embodies the mystery. At the same time, it's explaining. The whole poem is explain. It's this and not this. It's not that. It's not the sea. The sea is nothing without the singer. Nothing without the singer. Oh, sure, it's beautiful. It's powerful. It's, it has the plunging waters and the what was the wind again? There was a word for wind in here that I can't possibly. Oh, I love the sunken coral water wall. Oh, that is so beautiful. The heaving speech of air. The heaving speech of air. You can't put anything else in, substitute heaving with any other word that's as good as that. So all that's going on, nothing without the singer. It's a kind of valorizing of the poet without being sentimental, which I cannot stand, and self-congratulatory, which makes me cringe. But is the poem that I have to turn to when I get discouraged about everything out there going on, and not everything going on in poetry. Like this is for Lucian's, there's something else to feel good about and happy about and celebrate. Lucian's bringing us all together in this fabulous program. There's all kinds of good things going on in poetry to celebrate. Yeah. Okay, Lucian, did we get through it and say some things worth saying?
I have one question, Suzanne. I was wondering, the title, Idea of Order at Key West. I mean, it's mysterious too, it seems. Do you have any comment on it?
Well, it's giving us a clue. It gives me a clue, a big clue, like any really good title of a poem does. It should be, first of all, interesting and make us want to turn to that poem in the table of contents, as I sometimes do. I sometimes scan a table of contents and I look at what titles seem like they might be catchy and interesting. But it also tells me how to understand the poem. And I think earlier I contrasted it with the title that it isn't. And it doesn't say thoughts and feelings and emotions at Key West. And it doesn't say an idea about emotions and feeling stuff and remembering your childhood at Key West. I mean, there's a way that it goes beyond some conventional ideas about what poetry is to something much larger, an idea of order, but it doesn't say order at Key West. That would maybe claim a little too much. It's an idea of order. An idea of order is Stephen saying, okay, this is my idea. This is what my idea of what, and remember that the man was fascinated with the imagination all of his life, or not all, actually not all of his life, but the latter part of his life he was. What is the imagination? What does it do? What is it good for? I mean, we say imagine something or that you have a good imagination. What do we mean by that? So this is part of his exploration of what exactly is the poetic imagination. What does it do? This is his idea. And at the same time, invites you to, you don't like it, go write your own idea. But order is so important because it's so unsentimental, so fuzzy-wuzzy, touchy-feely. And sometimes contemporary poetry can, especially when people are just starting out or have barely started to read poetry, that's their idea of what poetry is. Well, as you go on, you find out it's actually a lot of things, not only that. Order sets us right, puts our feet right down on the ground. Let's get organized here. I like that. I like that almost push back against the sentimental. Does that help? That's my take on it anyway. Yeah,
Yeah, I like that. I like that. Thank you.
good.
I also had a question for you. First of all, I wanted to say thank you very much. Um, well, first I'll ask the question, but I probably need to frame it. Do you think that it's possible that Apophenia is the woman, or could be a name for the woman who's singing in the poem?
Could you remind me, Joel, who was apothemia?
Okay, apophenia is not actually a person's name. It's a Greek word which means the tendency of humans to try to make order out of things that are random.
Oh,
And so
sure.
if I can,
Sure, because the man knew his Greek. He knew
yes,
his Greek. I mean, I have a feeling now that you're saying that, because, well, the poem is very much at its core about making order out of the randomness of which it, and the sea is described again and again as meaningless. Somewhere in here he says meaningless, the meaningless plungings of water and wind. So there you have it, meaningless until it is framed in some way and is endowed with meaning, and is not endowed with meaning until it takes on some order, which means some shape. Something has to come first, and something has to come next, and something has to come after that. It's just not just the meaningless plungings of things mixing together in a random way. So I would think that that idea would be central to what Stevens is interested in. The one thing I think Stevens, and now we don't know what he would say if he could just walk out of the corner right now, like in that Woody Allen movie, was it Annie Hall, or which one was it, where he finally pulls the intellectual out from behind he's in the theater lobby or something, and he pulls him out, and and he gets the guy to explain exactly what he means by something he wrote in what is it? Which movie was that? It was one of the great Woody Allen moments. Anyway, I don't know if Stevens himself, this is my instinct, he wouldn't want to pin down that figure to one existing figure. It's one of Stevens' obsessions, isn't it? Art versus nature, the idea of artifice versus daily life, from Lisa. The supreme fiction, he called it. This I think somewhere in his writings, and it has been described, his writings has been described, his ideas been described as poetry as the supreme fusion of the creative imagination and objective reality. So that there you have it. And poetry is the supreme fusion. He doesn't say something else. He doesn't say painting, he doesn't say the play. For him, it's poetry. Somebody else might find it in music or somewhere else. He finds it in poetry. But yeah, I think he would not necessarily want to give her an exact name and pin her down, but it's right in that territory. So that's interesting, Joel, to weave in that. Wish I didn't have to go now. So David Kippen, David, thank you for coming, David. Thank you for coming, David, and thank you for. He selected my poem, everybody, for the LA Times article, which I hope you will all go see and go read and so on. I think Lucian sent you a link to it. Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah. All right, everybody. That was nice that we had David Kippen here, because David is a man to know. He is a man to know, not single-handedly. Others agreed. Oh, thank you to all those others. I'm just filled with gratitude these days. My noir self, my dark, cynical noir self is filled with gratitude. I'm not used to this. Okay. All right, everybody. Okay, should we go to hear Joel and hear what Joel has to say?
Yes.
Yeah, but actually, there's a couple of more things on this topic. I was really interested in this discussion. One point that I think solidifies your entire theory about the poem is that Stevens thought that poetry could possibly replace religion.
And you know who else felt that way and won my heart forever? He probably got the idea, or he might have gotten the idea from Wallace Stevens, because I was quite a follower, even though I didn't agree with him about everything. Didn't agree with him about the Clintons, for instance. Oh, he didn't like the Clintons at all. I like the Clintons. But anyway, Christopher Hitchens, you know who all know who Christopher Hitchens was? Very provocative intellect, and it made a lot of people mad all the time. He was constantly, but boy, was he witty. Oh, we're getting background feedback from somebody somewhere. We're getting a lot of background feedback, but I don't know where that's coming. But anyway, so I went to one of his smaller, I was always going off to hear him speak and argue with people, just partially because of his beauty of the language and the wit and gosh, he could take people down too. And he, of course, he took a strong stand against religion for some reasonable reasons, that it created a lot of death and bloodshed. And somebody asked him, and I was there it was in Roman's bookstore in Pasadena, as a matter of fact, a smaller audience instead of his usually hundreds of people that he would have. And somebody said, well, what do you think can replace religion? And he said, poetry. And so now we know and of course that just, I mean, became my great hero, other than all the areas I don't agree with him. But so, yeah, so that must have come from Stevens then. Isn't that interesting? Sure, let poetry, if it works for you, let poetry replace religion. Religion works for you, okay.
Yeah, it's strange, Suzanne, that he did say that the poet is the priest of the invisible. That was, I believe, a direct quote from Stevens. And there's also something in his book, which I'm recommending to all my fellow poetry junkies, which is The Necessary Angel, which is his series of essays. And in that he says about the imagination that, quote, it is a violence from within that protects us from a violence without. It is the imagination pressing back against the pressure of reality.
Oh, isn't that so interesting? Isn't that so good? And I have that little book. It's funny, I should have sat down and read that little book all the way through. I can do it now, but I think I wanted to, and I did a little research. I did some research on the poem, but I also wanted to I didn't want anything to too much mess up what I wanted to say. And but that's beautiful. It seems like he's suggesting poetry as a means of survival in the world, in the brutal world, the violence from within as a defense of the violence from without. Well, could you read that one more time?
Certainly. Just let me open it again. I think also, he lived such a weirdly demarcated life, in that he was really this vice president of the insurance company, and he was a poet who got a couple of Pulitzer Prizes. But I heard from a friend that at his funeral, there were all these, business types, executives getting out of limos. And then there were these long-haired hippies holding the poetry books. And somebody apparently remarked, Wally Stevens was a poet?
Yeah.
Such a demarcation of life. But this is the quote again. It is a violence from within that protects us from a violence without. It is the imagination pressing back against the pressure of reality.
Yeah, the imagination pressing back against the pressure of reality. It's making a place for you in the world. I mean, she said, it's why I don't think I can't imagine myself anything other than a poet. I really can't. I can't imagine myself happy as anything if I didn't have poetry in my life. And I think other people find it through other means, music, dance, and so on. But he says, yeah, and she was a single artificer of the world in which she sang. And when she sang, the sea, whatever self it had, became the self that was her song, for she was the maker. And that's the ultimate, really, that's the ultimate empowerment. And even empowerment, it seems like too small a word, of the poet and the poem, is that you are making not only a place for yourself in the world, but you are actually shaping the world. You're interpreting. Now, everybody does this to some extent. Even if you never write a line, people to some extent interpret the world around them, right? And it can be done in a very negative way, a very horribly negative way, like the conspiracy, what are with all these conspiracy theorists bringing up out of everywhere. There didn't used to be all these people who are they are also reinventing a world, but it's a kind of malevolent world. But I think what he's saying is the poet does it purposefully and knowing it and in full command of her or his or their powers, whereas other people do it sort of blindly and maybe semi-consciously. Do you think, is that a possibility? That's humility, maybe we're not asking you questions. I'm cutting cakes. Oh, Lori's there. Oh, is Lori there? Oh, Lori Badikian, another good poet, is kind of with us, but she's making cakes. She's making cakes for their 2 children. I think she's cutting the cake. Maybe, okay, so that's there it is, the empirical world. What did he call it? The veritable, he said, called the ocean veritable, the veritable world. That's right, cutting cakes and for children. Yeah. Boy, we have had such a good, I do not think in Harvard or Yale, or even in Oxford University, or even in Eton University or Cambridge, they have had a better discussion on Wallace Stevens, the idea of order at Key West. They haven't, I'm sure of it. I'm almost sure as it's possible to be of anything in this world. Don't you think, Lucian?
Oh, yeah. I mean,
they don't have such a good conversation as this, I'm positive.
well, as Melville said, the sea was my Harvard. And
yeah.
And I misheard it. I thought the person who quoted it for me had said the sea was my harbor, which I ended up putting into a poem. It was one of those Freudian slips that felt.
Oh, it's a fortunate mishearing, huh? Fortunate mishearing. But the sea was my Harvard, right? Real experience. Yeah.
Well, Suzanne, you're
a man who did not get the credit he was due, damn it, did not see the success that he deserved in his lifetime. What a shame. Yeah.
Now, your presentation, Suzanne, is not only a geyser of consciousness, it's just gorgeous. It's a gorgeous geyser of consciousness. But I will invite Joel to come to us now. And I want to say, by way of introduction, I mean, talk about a man who is a poem and is poetry and lives poetry. Joel and I met physically only once in Seattle last month, but I was privy to hear a wonderful anecdote from the lion's mouth, which is that when he had a poem accepted to poetry, which many of us have striven in vain to enter, he discovered that they were going to pay him $10 a line. And he decided to change his poem from a 45-line poem to a 90-line poem. He just cut every line in two and got paid 900 smackaroos for that same poem. So that's when he was
Wow.
able to
Listen,
press back against the pressures of the world with his wonderful imagination. So
I'm learning how to be a capitalist poet here today.
Joel,
Yes, yeah, that story was supposed to be between you and I, but
oh, sorry,
Um,
it still is.
yeah, it's all good. Yeah, thank you very much, Suzanne, for this. I just wanted to point out my book, my first collection of poems is called Ideas of Improvisation, and it's a direct riff on Stevens' The Idea of Order.
Wow.
And I have
Wow.
two poems in my book that specifically are written after Idea of Order at Key West. One of them is called Ideas of Improvisation at Newport, and it replaces the singer with John Coltrane.
Oh, I have John Coltrane in my car radio player right now. Yeah, a Love Supreme. I do love that. I do love that piece of music so much.
Yes, yes. And
William
so
Archula loves it too.
yeah, I think maybe a third of the poems in my book, the titles are An Idea of Improvisation at, and then it's a riff on it. And a central character in many of my poems is Apophenia,
Oh.
who I was reading as possibly the singer in Stephen's poem. So when you came today and said what you said, it was just like you put a lot of disparate ideas that I had into one unified theory. So that was like really, really amazing.
Wow. What a good, I just have to compliment Lucian on bringing us together. I mean, good instincts or good knowledge or both, I guess. Yeah, to bring us together.
Yeah. So quickly, what I wanted to talk about today was Gwendolyn Brooks' use of sound in We Real Cool. And I don't know if everyone is familiar with the poem, but if people could pull the poem up, it's a very short poem. We could talk about it. And so, for people who are asking, apophenia is spelled Apophenia. One of the things that I think is most important in poetry is an organized use of sound. So of course we know this because meter, for example, was an organized use of sound with respect to rhythm, whether it's stresses in Germanic languages or the length of vowels in other languages like Latin or Greek or Russian. That organization of sound is very important. And then the most obvious use of organization of sound in poems is rhyme schemes in languages that use rhyming. And in We Real Cool, Gwendolyn Brooks uses rhyming in a non-standard way. And I think her poem is influenced by the ghazal, which is ancient Arabic / Persian form of poetry, where all the couplets end with the same word. So in her poem, she shifted the rhyme scheme so that each line ends with the word we, except for the last line. And so part of my theory about the poem is that the use of sound directly reinforces the theme of the poem. She uses tension and resolution, and whereas like rhyme schemes use tension and resolution, you put out a word and then there's tension. The next rhyming word is the resolution of that. But if you set up a rhyme scheme and then you break it, you leave a kind of overarching tension. And she breaks it at the end with not using we at the end of the last line, but she also breaks it in another way. And that was the thing that I found most interesting. So just as a quick personal point, when I was 10 years old, I was riding the bus and they used to have poems on the buses as advertisements. And so that was where I first, for example, encountered the work of Wallace Stevens. His poem was The Jar. And I also saw the snowman there. But then one day I saw We Real Cool. And I just remember sitting there reading it. And then the next thing I know, the bus driver was tapping me on the shoulder. And he was like, you know, hey, we're at the end of the line. You have to get off the bus. And I had become so absorbed in the poem that I had rode the bus literally all the way to the end of the line, had no idea, and I had to walk back home, which fortunately wasn't that far. So I've been kind of obsessed with this poem for a very long time for lots of reasons. But one of them is I always felt that there was something else going on architecturally. And so part of what it is besides rhyme, which is the most famous sound device, there's alliteration. There's also assonance, which is the use of repeated vowel sounds. And then there's consonance, which is the use of repeated consonant sounds, usually terminal consonant sounds. So people are much more familiar with the other three than they are with consonants. But an example is if you look in the first line, she says, we real cool. So real and cool are consonant because they both end with the L sound. And so if you look at we real cool, one of the things that you'll notice is that there's some type of sound device within each line. It's either assonance, consonance, or alliteration, except for two lines. One of them is obviously the last line. And the last line also is the line that doesn't end with the we. And so it's this idea that she breaks the tension in two different ways with that last line. And I think that's one of the reasons why the poem has the emotional impact that it does. And so if you look, I'm trying to find real quickly, pull up the poem.
It's in the chat. Lisa posted it in the chat.
Okay, let me find it real quick.
Oh, Joel, and you know what? Phoebe Ozuna, who's here with us, said it would be great to hear you read the poem aloud too.
Okay. We Real Cool by Gwendolyn Brooks. The Pool Players, 7 at the Golden Shovel. We real cool. We left school. We lurk late. We strike straight. We sing sin. We thin gin. We jazz June. We die soon. And so, okay, so in the first line, it's consonants with real and cool. And then the next line doesn't have a sound device. It's left school. And then the next line is lurk late, which is alliteration, strike straight, which is alliteration, sing sin, which is assonance, thin gin, which is an internal rhyme, jazz June, which is alliteration, and then the last line, die soon, does not have. So the two lines that don't have sound relationships are left school, which is a type of breaking, and die soon, which is also a type of breaking. So the two places where she breaks her pattern and creates tension are things that involve the idea of a thing breaking or ending. And this is, I thought, a wonderful use of architectural use of sound to reinforce the meaning of a poem that doesn't involve the use of a rhyme scheme, and that also involves breaking of tension rather than resolving tension. And I think there's a number of poems, there's many poems that utilize sound in this architectural kind of way. And I think that poems that become kind of hit poems very, very often have some type of architectural use of sound that underlie them. And obviously Stevens' Ideas of Order at Key West is one of those poems, as well as Eliot's Proof Rock, for example, is another one of those poems. And Eliot was famously annoyed at the fact that Proof Rock was, for one of the poems that he was most famously associated with. But I do think it's an architectural use of sound that runs through that poem. So anyway, that's it. That's pretty much what I wanted to talk about with that poem.
fascinates me is just the funniest thing is I have never really zeroed in on her structuring of the line that ends with we, 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 all the way through. I mean, I think I knew this by heart, but I bet if you'd asked me to write it down earlier this morning or yesterday, I have a feeling I would have put the we at the beginning of the line. We lurk late, you know, and then end with the word that's going to rhyme on the next line. And I just am suddenly looking at it going, oh my goodness, it doesn't do that at all. It falls on the we. And that changes it in interest. I mean, because it almost seems like a celebration of the we do this, we do that, we go here, we go there, da 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 da, and then the die soon with no we in it, just die soon. And like you say, Joel, and I'm loving that opposition of like a bunch of guys out together and they're just living it up and they're cutting school and they're doing the, and then just bam, and the celebration ends in the last line. That's fierce.
Yes, and I did have an opportunity to briefly discuss this poem with Miss Brooks, and she did tell me that she originally wrote the poem in line. Because if you shift the we, then the poem is in rhymed.
Yeah.
And it does have perfect tension and resolution. And she shifted it specifically to avoid that.
That's so much more interesting. I mean, it takes on another level of tension. I just think that's so fat. Whoa, thank you. I learned something here today.
The lines sort of curve around, you know, they're continuous until you get to the last line when there's no more continuity. So that again reinforces that meaning or that particular kind of ending. But I think that, you know, the the kind of spilling over or continuity or the way life keeps going on until it doesn't is enacted exactly in the way, you know, that you described.
Yes, it's a waterfall effect.
Exactly.
Yeah, the sound spills all the way down until the end, and it puts an extraordinary amount of emphasis on that last line where, you know, all of the emotion sort of spills down and then pools at the end and reinforces the meaning of the last line. Yes.
And one would think that that's what the actors, you know, the characters assume, that it's just going to keep going on. So,
Yeah.
you know, maybe
like
it's
pulling the rug out from under you, huh?
right.
Yeah.
Yes.
And this is a poem where every single syllable is stressed. I mean, there's not a stressed and unstressed. Everything is a beat. Every single syllable in the poem is a beat.
Yes. And that's also very unusual.
I've never heard that before. That was really, really outstanding to me.
And Joel, how was Gwendolyn? I'd love to hear any personal impressions that you garnered from me.
I only got to talk to her for about 10 minutes. This was at Furious Flower in 1994, which was an academic conference that was held to celebrate her and her work, and well, also Black poetry in the U.S. in general. And she read, and then at the end, she signed books. And she did what I think one of the most gracious things I've ever seen. The line for people to have their book signed by her is the longest book signing line I've ever seen. It was hundreds and hundreds of people.
Oh.
She signed books for about an hour and a half. And I waited. I was trying to wait until the end so I could get, you know, a couple of minutes to talk to her. So I waited literally until the end. And when it got to the end, after this woman who was in her late 80s had been signing books for an hour and a half, she looked up. The people were cleaning up in the auditorium, and she said, "Is there anyone else who would like to get something signed before I go?"
Oh.
I mean, she was that gracious. I mean, I can't even imagine signing books for 30 minutes. I think I would have a hand cramp that, would last for hours. But so that's the type of woman that she was. And then, after all of this, she stood there and she talked to me for a couple of minutes specifically about this poem, and answered my couple of little questions. So she was an amazing person, very, very, very sweet and extraordinarily gracious, but also very, I think, conscious of, a lot of the things that she did in her work. I think of her often as I think of the music of Thelonious Monk, who had a different sound system in his music than other jazz musicians. And I think Miss Brooks had a signature type of sound, specifically with her use of alliteration, where you can recognize one of her poems almost immediately by the sound. There's other poets like that. Seamus Haney's like that. Wallace Stevens is like that to a certain extent, but Miss Brooks is definitely one of those poets.
Oh, it really says a lot for you that you were the one who stayed and stayed and stayed and I bet you don't mind the time that you waited, do you? Because it paid off, because you were able to talk to, I mean, she was by that time, and even before that time, a legend. She was a legend, and she was the last of the legend. I mean, she was, I guess, a very young during the Harlem Renaissance. She would have been almost a child, maybe, or a teen, I think. She didn't quite get to participate in the Harlem Renaissance, but I think she was maybe alive for it, and then sort of came in right after. And so she went back. Did she ever know Robert Hayden? She must have met Robert Hayden, right? Did she?
She did. They were actually very good friends.
They were what?
They were good friends.
Oh, they were, yeah. Because he's actually one of my favorite mid-century poets, Robert Hayden. Do people know Robert Hayden? Oh, I have to go. Okay, so somebody's leaving. Yeah. Oh, yeah. If anybody doesn't know Robert Hayden, he was a great one.
Oh, what did I know? Oh, what did I know of
Love's
and lonely office?
of Love's lonely offices, right? What did I know? What did I know of
Love's
love?
austere and lonely offices.
Of austere. I knew I was leaving something out. Okay, I knew I was
Yes.
austere. There was something else in there. Yeah, austere and lonely offices. The great couple of closing lines of modern poetry, I think. I mean, yeah. And then you completely reread the poem. I mean, you have an utterly new understanding of what the poem is about in those last two lines. Yeah.
Yeah, those Winter Sundays.
It's interesting.
His most famous poem, but Middle Passage is actually, I think, his most
Yeah.
important poem.
And and what about Middle Passage? And if those of you maybe haven't read Middle Passage by Robert Hayden, or those Winter Sundays, you've got a treat waiting for you. What amazes me about that poem is how everybody's suffering in it. Even the slave runner is suffering, right? It's just, and then surprisingly, he almost seems to have compassion for the most unsympathetic character, which is the slave master himself, who's also suffering along with the others in the ship. I mean, it's a complex. I like political poems, social political poems that have a complication in them, that somehow come at the subject from an angle that is not quite expected, or somehow overturns your expectations. It's a beautiful work, that poem. Yeah. And
yes.
yeah. Okay, William is saying good. We're glad. Thanks, William. William, thanks for coming so much. Thanks for coming. And we got to hear, we were visited by a couple and several great LA poets, everybody. William Archilla and his wife, Lori Bedikian, are wonderful, wonderful poets in Los Angeles. Oh my goodness, indeed. Yeah. Yeah. And also, you know what, it's interesting that both the poems that we discussed, I mean, if you just looked at them, you looked at one and looked at the other, you'd go, oh, these are two totally different poems. They're just so different. But they both are working with complicated ideas and things that are hard to express, hard to find a fresh way to approach. How do you really even talk about what Stevens is trying to get at without being horribly boring or monotonous or preachy or dull or academic? And how do you get at what Gwendolyn Brooks was trying to get at without saying the obvious, you know, which is you reap what you sow or something like that, but that's a cliche. So she found this other way to say it that endures and has endured. Both poems, which have in their different ways, have stood the test of time so far. One that can be easily memorized, and the other that can't so easily be memorized and is not even so easily understood. And yet in their separate ways, they can, here we are discussing them, everybody, and discussing them together. I would say another difference is, I think in Gwendolyn Brooks's life, she was probably a much nicer person than Wallace Stevens was, who, you know, I mean, he could be nice. I mean, what's interesting to me is that I think he was, without putting too fine a point on it, had some conventional ideas of his time, of his age, and I get a kick out of the fact that he's being discussed along with Gwendolyn Brooks, who I think he would probably not recognize. In fact, I know that he would not recognize her as a fellow poet. Yeah, he was. Yeah, he had the privilege going on. He also worked. He worked for what he had to an extent. I mean, applied himself. He put in labor, but he would not have recognized Gwendolyn Brooks as a fellow poet. But yet, wouldn't he be surprised? Because here he's being discussed, the two poems are being discussed together and we're finding commonalities. And both of them are trying to approach a large idea that is hard to put into words or make interesting in words, I think. So, yeah.
Yes, Stevens was famously racist, and one of his most famously racist statements was specifically about Gwendolyn Brooks. Actually.
I even know what it was. I even know that story. I even know that story. He was even a little more racist than some other people. I mean, I always look at people in the context of their times. I go, are they better than the people of their times, worse than the people of their times, or kind of in the same? Pretty much that's what was going on back in 1934, whatever. So, but he was, I know the story that Joel's referring to, and I mean, the irony of it is in the back of my head. He didn't know. He didn't know. What did he know? He didn't know damn thing. But we'd like to think that if he were alive today, he would have some different views, I would think. But he'd also be.
Yeah, I think I don't think that's the case.
You think he'd be the same person? He'd be the same.
Very much. Very
Maybe
much,
he's the same guy. It's hard to admit, because if you were born in a different time, though, you just would be a different person. You wouldn't be that person. So we never know. We never know. But yeah, he was also sort of, I mean, he was interesting because he was an unhappy man in his home life. He was so unhappy. So had such a miserable marriage. I mean, he and his wife just were not on speaking terms for years. And so he suffered in his own private way, I guess. Somebody had their hand raised a moment ago, I think. Who was raising their hand? Somebody. Jill, yeah.
Maybe I said that it's nice to see their poems in conversation here, given the history that we're talking about.
Exactly.
And we
Idiot.
haven't canceled Wallace Stevens, even though we're outing him for what we know, to be very problematic. But, one of those contradictions is that there's a lot to keep alive in his poetry.
Terrence Hayes discusses that. Exactly. I don't know, Lucian, you quoted Terrence Hayes at a big chunk of his writing in the email. Terrence Hayes has addressed that, and he said, look, I think he was talking about the Southern writer, Flannery O'Connor. And he said, yeah, he said something to the effect that, yeah, she was a racist, but so therefore I have to deprive myself of some of these great works of writing, and who am I hurting except myself, or something like that. He said, okay, I can hold the idea in my head that she was a racist, and I can also hold the idea in my head that this is a great piece of writing. And everybody comes to their own their own understanding with regards to those things. You have to kind of figure it out yourself, I think. Yeah, and we have to wrap our minds around Pound. Well, I'll tell you something. I have a story about Pound, not because I met him, because I didn't meet him, but Philip Levine said something very interesting about Pound that has always stuck with me and has sort of become my go-to truth about Pound. And Philip Levine was Jewish, and very consciously Jewish, not like something he didn't notice or recognize about himself, and extremely sensitive to anti-Semitism and so on. And of course, Pound was a terrible anti-Semitic. I mean, at the end, joined, at least was a fascist sympathizer, was a fascist, not just, over there and trying to make, I guess, apparently very incoherent radio broadcasts for the freaking fascists. It doesn't get worse than that. And I was mentioning this, and I was on a phone conversation with Phil, talking about poetry and talking about how I admire Pound's, the influence that he brought to modern poetry, which was so important. And anybody kicked poetry out of Victorian and Edwardian mannerisms and phoniness and opulence, and anybody did that, it was Ezra Pound. And I said, yeah, but then there was this other thing about him. And Phil said to me, but have you actually, I don't remember if he said read or listened to, he might have said read. Have you actually read, or maybe he said listened to those radio broadcasts that he made for the fascists? And I said, oh, I have some texts of them, and I started to read them, and I just stopped reading them, and they were so bad. And he said, but here's the thing. He was ungrammatical in those broadcasts. He was ungrammatical. And then he said, he was crazy. He'd gone crazy. Now he's talking about, and I knew immediately what he meant. Pound was the master of language, certainly the English language. also delved into Greek, delved into Latin, delved into Chinese, delved into Italian, delved in, kind of sampled many languages, explored many languages, but he was a linguist from nearly childhood. He didn't make grammatical mistakes. And when Phil said he was ungrammatical, what he was saying to me was he lost his fucking mind. And then he said he's crazy. He was crazy. And I thought that's just, nobody else other than a poet would think of looking at it that way. And so something was askew up there. And Phil seemed to be saying to me, once somebody's lost their freaking mind, they're over the edge and all bets are off. And I do think what we would call Pound in our time, see, that people could never figure out if he was sane or crazy. He was in that marginal twilight zone between sane and crazy. We now have a name for that. And does anybody know what name? We've all heard it. It's in the language, it's in the argot across the boards.
Bipolar?
Yeah, there you go, Lucian. There you go. Bipolar, which now is simply the word for something's going on and we don't know what. I mean, could be applicable in a lot of situations, but he would right away get diagnosed as bipolar and put on some kind of cocktail of medication, and then we don't know whether if that would affect his poetry or not. That's my analysis. Somebody else have a better analysis? Anybody? Joel, do you have another analysis? Or
Well, I would just say, I think we just have to be more comfortable with the fact that sometimes great artists are terrible people.
Oh, it's so true.
Pablo Picasso is one of my favorite visual artists, but he was an absolutely horrible person, particularly to women and the women in his life.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just one of those things. But I wanted to, you mentioned earlier Terrence Hayes and his statements about Wallace Stevens. And Terrence actually has a poem it's a short poem I'd like to share with everybody, specifically on the subject.
Mm-hmm.
And the poem is called Snow for Wallace Stevens.
Mm-hmm.
No one living a snowed-in life can sleep without a blindfold. Light is the lion that comes down to drink.
Oh.
I know tink and tank and tunk-a-tunk holds nearly the same sound as bottle. Drink and drank and drunk. Light is the lion that comes down. This song is for the wise man who avenges by building his city in snow. I know what he said in his poem, Decorations in a Nigger Cemetery. How, with pipes of winter lining his cognition, does someone learn to bring a sentence to its knees? Who is not more than his limitations? Who is not the blood in a wine barrel and the wine as well? I too, having lost faith in language, have placed my faith in language. Thus, I have a capacity for love without forgiveness. This song is for my foe, the clean-shaven, gray-suited, gray patron of Hartford, the emperor of whiteness, blue as a body made of snow.
That's beautiful. Oh, thank you. Oh, thank you. Yeah, thank you for that. I didn't know that poem. This is making me remember that I read something of Terrence Hayes saying no one was whiter than Wallace Stevens there as the director of Hartford Indemnity and whatever the rest of that title is.
Excellent.
Indemnity and insurance, no, and there's something, whatever. He said now, nobody was whiter, nobody was more expressive of privilege, and yet he loved his poetry or some of his poetry and was not going to cut that out of his life. He just, and it comes back to me now, but I didn't know they wrote this beautiful poem, which I love because it has complications in it. And because the poet is struggling. It's almost as if the poet is figuring out what he feels as he writes it. And it's not all boiled down to one thing. And it embodies and embraces the complexity and contradiction of people, of life on earth and people. And I love all that. That's going to be one of my favorite Terrence Hayes poems right now. That's just one of my, I think that guy's going to be a US poet laureate pretty soon, don't you think? Don't you think he's going to be a US poet laureate if he wants to be, unless he turns it down or something? But don't you think he's going to get offered that pretty soon, Joel?
In interest of disclosure, Terrence is one of my best friends. And
Oh.
so the answer to your question is no, he will not be poet laureate, but it won't be because the position wasn't offered to him. It's just not something that it won't be because it wasn't offered to him. Yeah, he's just not interested.
Yeah.
I want to add, I just want to add that Terrence Hayes wrote a fantastic rhapsody of Joel's poetry book in the Yale Review. That is everyone should look up, and it's really superb. And
oh, I will avail myself. I will avail myself of that book. Then I will avail myself of that book. But that you answered. Well, Joel, thank you for answering a question that was in my head, because I was wondering why he hadn't been already. And it did pass through my, it did occur to me that sometimes not everybody wants that job. Not everybody, I mean, really, there's reasons why it's, stuff.
I mean, his book of sonnets for my assassin, that's not the exact title, but that would be a tricky one for the poet laureate. I mean, I think, it could be great, but, it would make him a controversial poet laureate.
Well, the thing is, once you've assigned yourself to represent the state, even if it's a very good state, even if it's a relatively nice country compared to some other countries in the world that are more problematic, even, it's still you're the spokesperson for the state, and you better mind your manners. And that is something that is not necessarily for everybody. But anyway, interesting to know that. I will stop waiting for him to be anointed then.
Joel, could you tell us what his rationale for not wanting it would be?
I probably said too much at this point.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Probably fill in some of the blanks.
I do want to ask you, obviously you've to some extent forgiven the man, Wallace Stevens, for his horrific racism, but how is that for you? I mean, that must represent at least some kind of thorn in your side, even as you smell the roses that he proffered.
Yeah, forgiven is not the verb that I would use. But, I'm an American. And so that position, vis-a-vis Wallace Stevens is the same position that I would have with lots of America. I mean, it is what it is. That's a long conversation, but he is, in a sense, a metaphor for a lot of things about American Western civilization in general, which is one of the reasons why he's a central figure in my book. This is a way for me to introduce a lot of those kinds of conversations.
You know what? And I'm going to kind of take the same. So I find this an interesting subject because it's very much a subject of our times, and will, I think, be of the times that follow our times, and probably will not go out of style. I notice that something that affects me is when somebody has done something that's very bad, whether they have suffered. Somebody I really have a hard time with is Miles Davis. There's two things, and I'll tell you why. There's two things that make it a little bit different, a little worse. One, he actually put some pain on women, specifically Cicely Tyson. I mean, physical pain, beating somebody, it goes a little bit beyond calling somebody a name. That's one thing. But he probably was a tormented man in some way. But the other thing that, and this, I think about this sometimes because it weighs on me. When he was interviewed on 60 Minutes, he wasn't sorry for what he did for women. Some people do terrible things and then they suffer horribly for it. They're ashamed of it. It eats them alive. And he seemed not to care. It was like, yeah, well, it was like, that's how I roll kind of thing. But he beat a woman. That overshadows, I notice that overshadows when I hear his music, but it doesn't for other people necessarily. So it made me think about, well, in what cases am I able to make this separation, and in what cases am I not able to? And it has something to do with penitence, I think, in my mind. But that's something, and I'm only saying this because I think everybody here comes up against this. Especially when you admire somebody, you love somebody, you look up to them, and then you read their biography. And then you go, oh, crap. Oh, I hate this person, So it's just a constant. So you have to sort of figure it out for yourself. At what point, how are you? Yeah, all of that stuff. And you have to you have to find some peace. Otherwise, you'll start carving everybody out of, I can't read this person. I can't listen to that music. I can't do that. I can't see this movie. I can't, and you start depriving yourself. But I'll tell you one thing, powerful men, I don't know, powerful women, I would like to think that powerful women behave better. And I hope they behave a little better, although there's some powerful women out there who are every bit as bad as the powerful men. But boy, you put a man together with power, and when it comes to women, they will, oh my God, it's almost like they're all the same. I mean, the intellectuals, the great intellectuals of their age behave with women like a rock musician or some punk, head of a punk band or something, exactly the same. And then you have to kind of come to stop being surprised by that. I think, like, oh, I'm so shocked.
Yeah, I would agree. I just like to point out that Miles Davis was a person who thought that violence was a way of resolving disputes, whether the person was a man or a woman. He beat up several other jazz musicians as well. But I mean, his work is a contradiction for me as well. But like when I say, sometimes we have to be resigned to the fact that, great artists are sometimes terrible people. Miles is certainly very much at the head of that conversation.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. He's one of my favorite musicians, but at the same time, he was
changed jazz. He changed jazz. I mean, yeah, forever. I mean, if somebody brought such a force of influence into their art form that they changed it forever, you can't really argue with that. I mean, that's there. It's what is. It's like arguing with, you might as well argue with the moon. Get mad. Why are you up there, moon? Well, because it's up there, because it's the truth. It's the true moon. So it's kind of how I feel too. Was he an abused? Do you think he was beat up as a child, Joel? I think he was abused, maybe beat up by his father or something. Do you think?
I mean, the likelihood, capital punishment was not capital punishment. I'm sorry, corporal punishment was extremely popular then and now in the Black community. So I mean, to bring the conversation back around, it's it's a central part of Robert Hayden's poem, "Those Winter Sundays."
Yes.
And, they're both Black men from the Midwest.
What different men? What different? But he was but B'nai B'rith, B'nai, Robert Hayden was B'nai B'rith. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right.
He was Baha'i.
Baha'i?
Yeah, but I
He
Brit
was
is
Baha'i. B'nai B'rith is Jewish, but Baha'i is the
Baha'i. He
name
was
of the religion that he was
Baha'i.
a follower of.
Baha'i, that's how, and that is a religious group that believes in, well, in universal love, in embracing loving and forgiving all peoples. And he lived by that. But he really, I mean, a lot of people, now that is a good religion if you can live by it. And he really did, and paid a price for it too. Because when the Black Panthers came in, this is one of the reasons I admire Robert Hayden. I don't know, Joel, I think maybe there's not another poet that I can think of that I admire as much as I admire Robert Hayden for his character, for doing the thing that's hardest to do and so few people could do it. He stuck with what he believed in, even when what he believed in went way out of fashion in his peer group. When the Black Panthers came in and Black Power came in, he stuck to his benign, you call it his benign beliefs of universal love, even though it made him very uncool for quite a stretch.
Yeah, I wouldn't. This is a complicated conversation. I wouldn't say that it made him uncool, but there was a famous incident at a Black Writers Conference in Fisk in the 1960s.
Yeah.
Where he got in a very heated disagreement with Hakeem Mahabudi and Amiri Baraka. But Baraka was much more conciliatory towards Robert Hayden almost immediately, and always recognized his greatness as a poet.
I'm glad.
Always. With Hakeem
I'm glad
Mahabudi.
to hear that.
Yeah. So there was no point where Robert Hayden was ever out of fashion with Black poets, but there was a point where he was criticized by several prominent Black poets, but he was never out of fashion. I mean, there were other poets, Ishmael Reed, Lucille Clifton, for example, who were of that generation who,
who did respect him.
Well, all of them respected him. There was no point where he was not respected.
I see.
Even Hakeem Mahabudi.
Somebody fomented a movement, a little movement on the campus, and it was not Amiri Baraka, but it was the other person who fomented a little bit of but that person, I think, got a portion of the students were on that, I forget his name right now, on his side, I think. Yeah. But in any case, he met with some resistance, I guess. I thought there was an essay I read of him one time where he was saying he was meeting with a young student who thought, and he could tell, and he seemed to describe himself in her eyes as being, he didn't use the word uncool, but I seem to remember that he said she looked at him as somehow not current, not au courant, as the French would say. And yeah, but I don't know if that essay is in his collected essays, but okay, so there were always people. It's not, nobody ever just threw him to the curb. Yeah, he was always, he had admirers, as he should. But I still admire, I admire him very much for his character. I don't know a bad thing about Robert Hayden, not one bad thing. Yeah. Anybody else have anything that they want to add?
I think May had a question. She joined us late, but she has a question, so jump in. And I would ask, as a form of closure after this question is answered, if each of you who we featured today could read a poem of your own, that would be a lovely form of heroic closure to this fascinating conversation.
Okay, let me go. Okay. Well, let me go pick up. I don't have a poem with me right at this moment.
And May, what's your question?
I'm sorry, I joined the conversation so late. Hi, guys. Yeah, I've been having some health issues today, but and that's why my camera's off too. But you know, and I'm sorry I missed the presentation, you know, pretty much all of it. So I'm jumping in here without actually any kind of clue as to how pertinent it is, but you know, the whole thing, the whole idea of context and the idea of what's acceptable in the society, or what's that? Yeah, I'm thinking along the lines of corporal punishment. You know, I know in my parents' generation, I mean, there was no question, you know, a child misbehaved, you spanked him or her. And when they got to my generation, they tried to change that. You know, my mother, she misbehaved once, and I'm of Japanese descent, and she said that her mother had her kneel on a bag of rice for half a day. Yeah. So this idea of punishing children and essentially torturing them. You know, so when my parents got to my generation, yes, I got spanked, I got hit, but pretty much it was only on the butt. You know, that was the way they justified that. I don't have any kids, but my nephews and nieces, I'd say half of them don't do any corporal punishment at all. And the other half, it's, you know, maybe I yank on the arm and then go sit in the corner, you know, you're on timeout. So, you know, there's that, and hopefully there's change. But there's also the reignition of some questionable mores, accepted mores that can happen, you know, and we're seeing that now. You know, there was a local school board meeting, and this man got up, and there were some a Black group. They were all wearing T-shirts, and this was a Zoom meeting. I couldn't quite see what was written on their T-shirts, but this white man got up and started saying, you know, he was afraid of these people. And, you know, they come in and they're, I forget the term he used, but it was, and I assumed that their shirts said Black Lives Matter, you know, that he was afraid of the Black Lives Matter movement. No, their T-shirts were a totally different, they were just Black faces in the room. And he just was flipping out at the mic in front of everybody. So, you know, I think these are deeply, the tendency towards violence is a deeply human thing. And I think in every generation, and maybe in every 10 years or so, maybe, you know, we have to, as a society, reform and readdress these issues, because violence is part of being human. The tendency to hug and the tendency to strike, I think, you know, is just there. It's in us. So for my poem, so I have to give a trigger warning. This poem is about the Holocaust. I'm originally from Hawaii. Yes, my family were of Japanese descent. And this is a poem about one of my uncles. All right, so it's called When Nothing Is All You Can Do. I came home from high school and told Uncle Hiro that some people said the Jews were never rounded up and killed during World War II. People like that, he said, they all bullshit. How would you know? I asked the 8th grade graduate, truck driver for the sugar plantation, the sloppy weekend drunk. I was there, he said. I was a truck driver for the engineering unit. You never seen such suffering. There is they was like this. And he held up a thumb to the tip of his finger. And they so weak, they just fall down and lie on the ground. Their mouth was moving, but no can make sound. Like they was gone mock it right there in front of us. And we no can do nothing for them. We give them chocolate. They fight and eat the pepper and all, and then throw up. We try, give them water. They throw up. We had to leave them there in the road. We give them our blankets, but we had to go. We no can do nothing for them, nothing. And they tell us, thank you, in English, thank you. He cried and cried and couldn't stop. So this whole thing about praising, or recognizing someone's basic humanity, it's to me, that's just their basic humanity. We're gonna praise our president for speaking out against anti-Asian violence. That's the minimum as far as I'm concerned. When I've recited this poem to some audiences at a reading, some people have come up to me and said that my uncle was one of the honored people. What I forget what it is. There's, I guess, a Jewish organization. They have a wall with names on it of people who have saved Jews during World War II. And I said, no, for my uncle, he was just being a human being. As far as praising a politician or a leader or a teacher or an artist, musician, whatever, for just being basically decent, a basic decent human being, I'd rather praise Harriet Tubman or some other actual heroes. But anyway, that's my poem.
I found that very powerful. Thank you so much for sharing.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I usually limit us to 90 minutes, but this has been so marvelous, like a great film that deserves, a longer running time. But let's bring it to a closure with these last two poems, one poem from Suzanne and one poem from Joel.
Yeah, I can go now so Suzanne can have a little bit more time to find her poem. My poem is titled Sunday Poem, and it makes a reference to a line from Wallace Stevens' poem Sunday Morning, where he states that death is the mother of beauty. Sunday Poem. Gary Lilly and I discussed a famous poem which claims death is the mother of beauty, walking up First Street Northwest. Just before the last streaks of sun leaked from the sky above Renee's crib, where we hold our Black Rooster workshop. I recall holding Ronald early one church morning after he got shot on his mama's front steps, how his eyes rolled like white marbles, and began wondering if the same logic which produced that poem also perhaps implied the mushrooms that clouded Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Someone yells from an idling green van. We look over and it's Melvin, who used to have dreads and clown about the killer when he was in my writer's corps workshop at Lorton Prison. Only now he's free and has shaved his head. The light changes and Melvin pulls off, so I tell Gary the killer joke. And we laugh so hard, I almost missed the carnations placed by the stop sign or the wine bottles arranged around them like decorations in a nigga cemetery. Gary says, damn, just as I peeped the blown up photograph held to the firebox by maybe half a roll of Scotch tape. And what does it mean that the name Pooh is written in blue ballpoint above a brother crouching as I once crouched in nightclubs posing for $5 pictures? Perhaps I recognize this kid flaunting Nikes that matches Nautica jacket because I passed him or someone similar to him coming out of the liquor store on the corner of Florida Avenue last Friday when I stopped to cop a bottle of Evian and some juicy fruit. Their hair was cornrowed and they cradled a beer in one hand while holding the door with the other. And I mumbled thanks before the door swung shut. There are 2 dates, neither of which are dried fruit scrawled under the feet in the photo, and I lean in to nose one of the carnations. Now, my eyelashes clump as I recall stringing Ronald's Nikes from the power lines above his mother's crib. I pull my lucky geode from a front pocket and set it down near the bottles. Then step back under a sky that's gone all black to ponder what Stevens might have written if the beauty he so loved, he so believed in, only sometimes believed in him.
Joel, is that in your book? I'm looking forward to
Yes, yes, it is.
I'm looking forward to getting your book, Joel. I am going to go and I'm going to go. Should I get it on Amazon? How do you want me to get that book? What's the best way? Through the publisher directly?
Yeah, there is a link. I guess I could put it in the chat. I could find it and put it in the chat. I mean, you could get it from Amazon, but there is a link from the distributor, actually.
Okay, good. I like that. I love the voice of that poem. It's my kind of poetry. Okay, so this was published and then republished. You can find it online in Airlight magazine, the online magazine that comes out of USC Air/Light, and along with a couple of my noir poems, but I'm not going to read a noir poem today. Then it was republished in Christopher Buckley's great little literary journal Salt, where he has a feature called Another Look, and then he republishes a poem that had appeared before. And this has never actually been in print, only online. So, and I'll just say this about this poem. It's very difficult for me. I don't know about you all, the rest of you. It's very difficult for me to get joy into a poem without it all getting all mushy, fuzzy wuzzy, touchy feely, sentimental, and all of that. So finally, after this was not written this year during the heavy rains. Boy, did we have heavy rains in LA this year. But a few years back when we had heavy rains after a terrible couple winters of drought, and I found finally I can write my happy poem. I only have one, so I'm gonna have to stand for all my happiness. And it is called, I'm driving to Fresno, and I don't care who knows it. The 110 to the 5, then up 99, Famosa, Dinuba, past silos filled, the signposts swear with milk, California milk, so much greens, jewel greens, edibles, wearables, and those ones so new they squeak, they almost squeak out some words. Greens bound over the earth, drip from trees, an abundance, a goodness, because the rains came, and those clouds, no, not ordinary clouds, great swallowing beastly things you could not drive through. In such vapor, you'd vaporize. Like I said, I'm heading to Fresno, and I don't care who knows it. After the long drought, dry winters followed by dry springs, aching trees, roots weeping. Some scientists say that they weep. Now wild, disorganized flowers, and that road sign there, cheese factory, all kinds of cheeses. If you can't find your cheese here, we don't have it. Mango, ice, mallow, storm water, lotus. I'm making these up, names of flowers, new colors, Cadillac rose plant, blue ink pot, like I'm trying to tell you, to confess, to put you on notice. I'm in a good mood and nobody can tell me I'm not. So that's that one. My happy poem.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, so we will take off. Okay, all right, Lucian. Yes, indeed. Great combo. Great combo. All right.
Thank
Yes,
you.
yes,
Thank you so much.
yes. A
Thank you.
stunning combination.
Thank you all.
A little of everything. Got a little of everything in here.